My phone buzzed in the parking lot at 11:19 on a Tuesday morning in November, and when I looked at the screen, the message said, "Where did you park?" I had been in the car for 40 minutes. I want to be transparent about that, not because it flatters me, but because it tells you everything about where I was, in every sense that matters. I had paid for short-term parking that I didn't need, had told myself I was going inside to help with the bags, which was true, and then I stood at the security entrance after she went through the scanner line and disappeared around the corner toward departures, and I stayed there until I couldn't see the back of her coat anymore. Then I walked back to the car. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and the window cracked, and stared at a parking structure pillar for the better part of an hour, having a conversation with myself about starting the car, that the car kept winning. I read the message again. Where did you park? She had been through security. I had watched her go. She had a backpack she'd specifically packed to be carry-on compliant. She had that kind of discipline, that specific forethought, when she was committed to something. She was on a one-way to Oslo with a research fellowship that people in her field applied for twice before they got it, if they ever got it. She had applied twice. She was supposed to be past the gate by now. She was not supposed to be texting me from my own side of the security line. I typed back, short-term lot, level 2, why, no question mark. I was aware of the absence of the question mark. Her response came in 40 seconds, stay there. She came through the departure doors 6 minutes later and crossed the airport road and walked into the parking structure. I saw her before she saw me, which gave me a few seconds to arrange my face into something less than what it actually was. She was wearing the same coat she'd had on when I picked her up that morning, the one with the worn cuff on the left sleeve that she kept meaning to replace. She did not have her backpack. I got out of the car. She walked toward me across the concrete, and she was not running, and she was not crying, and she did not look like someone who had just made a decision she was uncertain about. She looked like someone who had been carrying a decision for a long time and had finally set it down somewhere, and was walking lighter for it. "You checked a bag," I said, when she was close enough to hear me at normal volume. "I did," she said. "Where is your bag right now?" She looked at me. "Oslo." I stood with that for a moment. "Your bag is in Oslo," I said. "On its way. Everything you own." "Not everything," she said. "I'm here." She got in the passenger seat because I still had the door open on that side. I got back in the driver's seat. I looked at the steering wheel for a few seconds, trying to locate a version of myself that knew what the appropriate next move was. Then I started the car, because that at least was a decision I could make. We drove to a diner 3 miles from the airport that neither of us had been to before, equidistant from everything, belonging to nothing, which felt correct for what we were about to do. We sat in a booth near the window and ordered coffee. Neither of us touched the coffee. She looked at the table for a moment, the way she looked when she was organizing something internally. Then she looked at me. "I filed it this morning," she said, "before you picked me up, before any of this." I didn't know yet what she meant. I would, very shortly. I need to tell you something about Danny and me before I tell you what she filed, because the context matters. We had known each other for 3 years, had met in our first week of graduate school at an orientation event where we had both arrived early and found ourselves the only 2 people standing at a table of complimentary coffee with absolutely nothing to say to the other people who arrived later. We had talked for 2 hours about marine carbon cycles and data visualization, which tells you something about both of us. By the time everyone else had left, she had my number, and we had plans to look at a data set she was working on that had an analytical problem she thought someone with my background might see differently. What we were to each other for 3 years was, specifically, the person, the one you texted when something went right or wrong, the one you looked for in the room when you walked into a seminar, the one you drove 2 hours to see give a conference presentation that you were not strictly required to attend, and then didn't tell them you had been there, because you didn't have a language for why you were there that felt safe to say out loud. We had never said any of the things we had been not saying for 3 years. We had been, as far as I could tell from my side, very dedicated to the project of being close enough that saying anything more would be a risk not worth taking. This is a thing people do. It is not a good thing to do. I am describing it accurately but not approvingly. She had applied for the Oslo Fellowship the previous spring. She had told me the night she submitted the application, over the phone, with the particular excitement of someone who had done something they were proud of. She had gotten it in August. She had told me at a coffee shop, and I had congratulated her, and I had meant it, and on the drive home I had thought, this is what it costs to spend 3 years not saying anything. This is the bill. I had driven her to the airport because that is what you do. That is what you do for someone you love when loving them means not making it harder for them to leave. She had submitted a research integrity complaint to the university at 6:47 that morning. I want to be precise about what Danny had been building for the past 8 months, because it matters for understanding what she turned around at a gate for and what she came back to. Professor Merritt had been a senior figure in the department for 22 years. He had the kind of institutional weight that accumulates slowly and then becomes self-defending. Graduate students who needed his letters of recommendation for fellowships and jobs, junior faculty who needed his name on funding applications, a department that had been partially built around his reputation and was not inclined to question the architecture. He had his name on 3 major external fellowships. He gave the kind of well-attended conference talks that end with the 15 people who work in the same specific niche giving him a standing ovation. He was considered a pillar. He had also been, systematically for at least a decade, putting his name on graduate students' work. Not as a collaborator, as a co-author, claiming work he had not done and adding himself to the authorship line. The students were early enough in their careers that they needed his letters more than they needed their own names first on a paper. The power differential made it easy to frame as a collegial understanding. It was not a collegial understanding. It was appropriation, repeated, over years, by a man who had made himself indispensable enough that nobody felt they could afford to say so. Danny had noticed it 18 months into her PhD. She had gone back into the publication records and compared papers to what she knew of the research. She had talked to 2 graduate students who were far enough out of his orbit now to speak carefully and off the record. She had started keeping a folder, not as an act of confrontation, as an act of documentation. She was a scientist. She gathered evidence the way she gathered any evidence, methodically, with attention to source and date and chain of custody. By this past spring, she had 8 months of material, emails in which Merritt had claimed contributions he had not made, signed written statements from 2 former students, and a reconstruction of one paper's full drafting history that demonstrated, with the specificity of version-controlled files and dated drafts, that his contribution had been substantively less than his authorship position implied. She had been sitting on it since spring. "Why didn't you file sooner?" I asked. She looked at her coffee. "Because he wrote my fellowship letter," she said. The Oslo fellowship recommendation was his. Without it, without his specific endorsement, given his position on the selection committee, she did not have Oslo. She had known this. She had made a decision that I understood completely, and that still sat uncomfortably in my chest. She had taken the fellowship, planned to file from Norway, and put 12 time zones between herself and the moment of impact. I was going to do it from there, she said. File remotely from a safe distance. Let it land while I was somewhere it couldn't land on me. What changed at the gate? She looked out the diner window. A plane was climbing into the gray. I had the form ready since May, she said. Everything drafted. I just had to submit. I was sitting at my kitchen table at 6 in the morning and I thought, you are about to spend a year in Oslo writing field notes and checking the institutional email from 6,000 miles away, because you were afraid to be here when what you built actually landed. She was quiet for a second. That didn't feel like something I could live with, not after everything. She submitted the form at 6:47. Then she finished packing. Then she texted me that she was ready to go. She had applied for Oslo while she was already building the folder. I didn't know this until the diner. She had applied in the spring, around the same time she had the 8 months of documentation and was trying to decide what to do with it, and the fellowship had been partly, not entirely, but partly, a way of resolving the question in a direction that didn't require a direct confrontation. If she got Oslo, she could file from Oslo. She could be safely abroad, professionally established, beyond the immediate reach of the decision. She could do the right thing from a distance that felt manageable. She said this at the diner table with the coffee going cold, without apology but also without pretending it was the whole truth. You built something for 8 months, I said, and then you built a way to not have to be here when it mattered. Yes. And you got on the plane anyway. I got as far as the gate. I thought about that. The gate is pretty far. The gate is very far, she said. I was at the gate. I had my boarding pass out. I was going to board. She looked at her hands, and then I thought about what I had done at 6:47 that morning and what I was about to do at 11:45, and I thought, these two things are not the same person. One of them is the person I have been building for 8 months. The other one is someone running from what she built. She looked up. I didn't want to be the person running from what she built. The morning came back to me differently, the way she had seemed already decided when I picked her up. Not nervous, not wavering. I had read it as composure. It was someone who had already done the hardest thing. You filed it, I said, and then got in my car and went to the airport anyway. Yes, you were still going. I was still going. So what happened at the gate? She picked up the coffee mug and held it in both hands. I was sitting in the boarding area, and I thought about what I had just done, what it meant. And I thought about the two people in this situation who were about to have to face something. Merritt, who was going to find that documentation in his inbox, and me, who was about to get on a plane to somewhere I wanted to go. She paused. And only one of those things felt like something I had built. The first call came at 12:30. Her phone rang and she looked at the screen, and I watched her face do the thing it did when something she had expected arrived slightly sooner than she'd anticipated. She answered. Said very little. Said yes, she understood. Said she would follow up in writing. Hung up, fellowship coordinator, she said. My outbound flight flagged when I didn't board. They need a status update within 24 hours. Merritt? He'll know by this afternoon. When the department receives the integrity complaint notification, his office gets a courtesy copy. She set the phone down precisely. And then we'll see what he has and how willing he is to use it. We found out at 3:47. By then, we had left the diner and driven back to my apartment. Hers was technically sublet, the assumption having been that she would not need it past today. We were in my kitchen when the email arrived. I watched her face while she read it. Merritt had sent messages to 3 people in the same hour: the Oslo Fellowship Committee, the chair of the department, and the director of the graduate program. Each message was framed as concern. He said he had become aware that Danny had missed her outbound flight and felt a responsibility, as her recommender and as someone who cared about her academic success, to flag that he had noticed over the past year some signs of difficulty managing high-pressure situations. He said the word stress 4 times. He said she was a genuine talent. He said he hoped a moment of anxiety would not jeopardize something she had worked so hard for. He did not mention the research integrity complaint. He had received the notification. The timestamps showed his messages going out 38 minutes after the notification would have landed in his inbox. He had read what she filed. He had made a calculation. His strategy was to get ahead of it by establishing a narrative. She was struggling. She had missed her own flight. She needed support. The complaint, when people heard about it, would look like the action of someone who was overwhelmed and making poor decisions. The fellowship committee email had an additional line. He suggested that given the circumstances, the committee should consider whether the position needed to be offered to the alternate candidate. He was trying to revoke her slot before she could respond. He's moving fast, I said. He's been in this position before, she said. He knows the window. If he can establish the narrative before the inquiry gets traction, the inquiry becomes a he said, she said, and he has 22 years of institutional credibility, and I have a missed flight. She looked at her laptop. He has 48 hours before the inquiry notification goes department-wide. He's using them. What's the deadline on the fellowship deferral? She was already checking. 5 p.m. tomorrow. If I don't submit a formal deferral request by then, the position goes to the alternate. 26 hours. Between her first text and the confirmation email, there were 26 hours. I want to tell you what those hours looked like, because I think the way 2 people spend 26 hours on a deadline they didn't expect to be facing together tells you something true about them. We went through her phone that first evening. Every message Merritt had sent her since the beginning of the year. Every email that touched on authorship or credit or our shared work. Every communication that was professional in its language and calculated in its implication. She had most of it saved already. I made a folder. She organized it by date. We cross-referenced the timestamps with the publication records she had from her original documentation. This email, sent on this date, about this paper, from a man whose contribution to that paper she had reconstructed through version histories and draft records to have been minimal at best. She talked me through the reconstruction of the paper. It was the clearest piece of evidence she had, and she explained it the way she explained her actual research, methodically, precisely, with the particular energy of someone who has spent months organizing information and is finally getting to use it. I made notes. I asked questions when I didn't follow. She answered them. By midnight, we had a summary document that laid out the documented pattern across 5 papers, 3 years, and a consistent strategy of claiming collaborative credit on work produced substantially or entirely by students whose careers depended on his goodwill. We went to bed eventually, which felt strange and necessary in equal measure, and in the morning she submitted the deferral request and we waited. The waiting was its own thing. She worked. She was, I realized watching her, not someone who managed uncertainty by filling time. She managed it by continuing to do what she had been doing, which was building the case, organizing the record, being precise. She sent 2 follow-up emails to the Integrity Office. She pulled together the version-controlled file history she had been keeping and formatted it for submission as supporting documentation. She moved through the hours with the specific focus of someone who is not going to be caught unprepared for whatever comes next. I made coffee. I answered emails from my own work. I watched her across the table and thought about the 3 years of not saying anything and what exactly I had thought I was protecting by not saying it. I want to be precise about Professor Merritt before I tell you what happened next, because understanding what he had built matters for understanding what it took to dismantle it. 22 years in a department is long enough to make yourself into part of the infrastructure. He sat on 3 external fellowship review committees, including the one that had selected Danny for Oslo. He had 2 former students now in senior positions at research institutions who considered him a mentor. He had 20 years of institutional goodwill stored like savings, and he had been careful never to draw it down all at once. He had simply been present, reliably, consequentially, in every room where decisions were made about early career researchers' futures. 2 students before Danny had noticed the authorship pattern. One had documented it, neither had filed. Both had decided, separately, that the cost of crossing him outweighed the cost of absorbing the credit loss. He had not done anything to them afterward. He hadn't needed to. The absence of punishment was its own message. I know what you decided. I know what it cost you. That is the arrangement. Danny had not told me any of this while she was building her case. She had told me she was dealing with something in her department. I had known it was more than that and waited for her to tell me when she was ready. And she had not told me before today, and I had accepted that as her right and driven her to the airport. I was sitting in my kitchen in November fully understanding, for the first time, what she had been carrying alone for 8 months. There is something particular about the way Danny talked about the work, the integrity case, her research, the documentation, that I had always noticed but had never fully articulated to myself until those 26 hours. She did not separate the personal from the institutional. When she talked about what Merritt had done, she talked about it as a scientific problem, a systematic error in the record that needed to be corrected, evidence that existed and needed to be properly attributed. She was not unaffected by it, she was clearly and precisely affected by it, but she approached the correction of it the same way she approached any other problem that required careful documentation and a clear chain of evidence. This was not emotional distance. It was the opposite. She cared enough to be exact. I had known this about her for 3 years. I had seen it in her research presentations, in the way she talked about her field, in the way she managed problems that would have sent most people into recursive loops of worry. She was a person who organized things when she cared about them. The folder she had been building since spring was love, in the vocabulary she had for it. Love for the students who had been robbed, for the record that had been falsified, for the version of her own work that was still entirely hers and that she was going to make sure stayed that way. I was sitting in my kitchen watching her organize a file folder at 2 in the afternoon and understanding, with the specific clarity of someone who has been looking at something for 3 years and is only now seeing it properly, exactly who I had been not saying things to. By 7 that evening, 2 things had happened. Danny had sent her formal deferral request to the fellowship committee, 2 measured paragraphs citing a research integrity situation at her current institution requiring her presence. She attached nothing yet. She named nothing yet. She requested the deferral and gave herself until the deadline the following afternoon. Then, at 7:12, an automated acknowledgement arrived from the university's Office of Research Integrity. It confirmed receipt of her complaint and the reference number. It said a formal inquiry would open within 10 business days. It said she would be assigned a contact investigator. It also said, and this was the line that changed the temperature of the room, that 2 additional complaints concerning the same faculty member were already on file, and that her submission would be considered in conjunction with the prior record. She read that line aloud. Then she read it again. 2 others, she said. The students who gave you statements. They gave me statements, she said slowly. I didn't know they had also filed separately. I thought they were just witnesses. She set the phone down. They filed independently. Before me. Before I even reached out to them. That was the moment I saw something shift in her face. Not triumph, not relief exactly. The specific expression of someone who has been carrying something they believed was only theirs, and has just found out they were not carrying it alone. That what they built and what they risked was part of something larger than they knew. The Integrity Office called her the following week. Not the automated acknowledgement. The assigned investigator, a woman named Dr. Reyes, who was matter-of-fact and thorough, and who asked Danny to walk her through the documentation in sequence. Danny did. I sat at the kitchen table while she was on the phone, out of the room but close enough to hear the shape of the conversation. Methodical, precise, Danny answering each question fully and then waiting for the next. An hour and a half. When she came back to the kitchen, she sat down and said, the drafting history on the paper is the strongest piece. She said it's rare that someone documents at that level of granularity. You always version controlled everything. I always version controlled everything, she agreed. I did it because I was taught to, not because I thought I'd need it as evidence one day. And the 2 prior complaints? Independent. Filed by the students directly. Dr. Reyes said they're similar in character. Same pattern, different papers. She picked up her coffee. She said the fact that 3 complaints describe the same behavior across different students and different years is significant. She said the cases will be considered together. I watched her while she said this. The particular face she made when she was processing something that was both worse and more resolved than she had expected it to be. The folder she had built for 8 months had found 2 other folders it hadn't known about. The things she thought she was building alone had other architects. He thought each of you was alone, I said. We were alone, she said. We just weren't the only ones. The letter from the Office of Research Integrity came faster than either of us had expected. Not a final resolution, but a formal communication sent to Danny's institutional address and also, on the record, to the department. The inquiry had opened. The complaint had been reviewed for preliminary merit and found sufficient to proceed. Standard protective measures had been enacted. The faculty member in question had been notified. His active role on fellowship and hiring review committees had been suspended pending the inquiry's conclusion, and a formal hold had been placed on any letters of recommendation originating from his office. He was off the committee. His letters were suspended, which meant the message he had sent to the Oslo Fellowship Committee, the message suggesting Danny was unstable, that the alternate candidate should be considered, that she was a talent experiencing a moment of anxiety, had been sent by someone who, as of that same afternoon, was under formal investigation for the conduct her complaint described. The committee could read that sequence. Any reasonable person reading that sequence could draw their own conclusions about what the concern message had actually been. Danny submitted her deferral request that evening, several hours before the deadline. The fellowship coordinator responded within 40 minutes confirming the deferral had been granted. 12 months. The position would be held. She read the confirmation email out loud in my kitchen, and then she set the phone down and was quiet for a moment. And then she said, I need to tell you something I didn't tell you at the airport. I looked back, she said. I waited. When I went through security, I looked back before I turned the corner. She was not looking at me while she said this. She was looking at the table, at the confirmation email on the screen. You were still there, at the entrance. You were just standing there. I didn't say anything. I thought about that the whole time I was walking to the gate, she said. You drove me to the airport. You went inside even though you didn't have to. You stood there, and you were going to let me go without saying anything. because you had decided that was what I needed, and you were going to be good about it and not make it harder." She looked at me. "You were going to be so good about it." "Yes," I said. "You idiot," she said, gently, completely without anger. There is something I have never told anyone about that drive to the airport. I had spent 3 weeks rehearsing a goodbye. A real one, a goodbye that meant what it said, that communicated without language that I thought she was going to do something extraordinary, and I was not going to make her feel the weight of what I hadn't said on the way out the door. I had been building that goodbye like a structure, placing each piece carefully, the thing I would say about Oslo, the thing I would say about her work, the way I would hug her at the curb and not hold on too long. The drive was 50 minutes. The whole 50 minutes I was rehearsing, and then she was through security and I was in the parking lot I had paid for, and I could not make myself leave. I was going to be so good about it, I told her. "I know," she said. "That's what made it impossible to watch." The conversation about the drive happened later that evening, after the confirmation email, after the coffee had gone cold again and we were still sitting in the kitchen because neither of us had moved. She told me she had looked back through the security line. I told her about the 40 minutes in the parking lot. Neither of us had been particularly surprised by the other's confession, which is something I have thought about since. "I almost didn't text you," she said. "I had your text in the draft for 10 minutes before I sent it. I kept thinking, what if he's already on the freeway? What if I'm making this harder? I was in the parking lot. I know now, but I couldn't assume." She stopped. "We've been very careful," she said. "Very. For 3 years. Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she said. Not accusatory, genuinely curious, the way she was genuinely curious about things she wanted to understand. "Because you had Oslo," I said. "Because before Oslo you had the fellowship application, and before that you had the chapter defense, and before that you had the data collection trip. There was always something you were building that mattered more than me being complicated about a feeling." She looked at me for a long time. "I had the same ones," she said. "Your postdoc application, your publication, the contract that almost fell through." A pause. "There was always something. There will always be something." "Yes," she said, which is the argument for saying it, not against. Her bag came back 2 days later from Oslo, flagged as unaccompanied and held at the overseas terminal pending instruction. It arrived intact, as these things generally do when the system works. Most things came back. The dissertation chapter Merritt had tried to absorb came back. She published it under her name alone, 18 months later, in a journal she had submitted to herself without his involvement. The integrity inquiry took the better part of a year. I will not try to describe each step of it, because those steps were institutional and procedural, and not mine to describe. What I can say is that the documentation Danny had assembled, the email records, the authorship comparisons, the signed statements, the reconstructed drafting histories, was, as the assigned investigator told her, among the most systematically thorough self-generated documentation they had reviewed in a proceeding of this kind. The inquiry concluded that authorship had been improperly claimed on 5 papers over 11 years. Professor Merritt was formally censured by the university. He retired before the conclusion of the process. He had held the committee seats and the letter-writing power and the institutional standing for 22 years. What dismantled it was a folder that a first-year PhD student had started keeping because she was a scientist, and documenting things was what she knew how to do. The morning after the confirmation came, she went back to her sublet to collect the things she had left behind. The apartment she had arranged for someone else to take over on the assumption that she would not be returning to it. That sublet fell through, quietly, as these things do when the timeline moves. The building manager, when she called to explain, was pragmatic about it. She kept the apartment. She also spent part of that morning calling Oslo. The fellowship coordinator, the assigned research supervisor, the administrative contact whose email had been in her saved documents for weeks. She explained, in each call, that a research integrity matter at her institution had required her to defer, and that she looked forward to the position the following year. She was warm and precise. She did not dramatize it. By noon she had spoken to everyone she needed to speak to, and the administrative reality of her year had been restructured into something that had room in it for the next 12 months. I watched her make the calls from the kitchen table, and I thought about the person who had been carrying the folder for 8 months, and the fellowship application, and the one-way ticket, and the plan to file from 12 time zones away. All of it at once, all of it managed, all of it inside a person who had also, apparently, been not saying things to me for 3 years. We were, I thought, quite well matched in our capacity for carrying things quietly. She deferred the fellowship for 12 months. She used the year differently than she had planned, finished her dissertation, contributed to the inquiry as a named complainant, rebuilt the work that had almost become someone else's. When Oslo came around again, she applied and was offered the position again, and this time she went. She came back from Oslo with a year of field data, 2 publications, and a return ticket that had been booked before she left. There is something I find myself returning to when I think about those weeks. Not the big things, the inquiry, the deferral, the bag coming back from Oslo, but the small ones. The way she made the phone calls to Oslo in the same quiet voice she used for everything else. The fact that she had version-controlled every draft of every document since her first year, because she had been taught to and hadn't thought twice about it, not knowing it would matter in the way it eventually did. The way she organized a file folder in the middle of a crisis the same way she organized one on a normal Tuesday. Precision was not something she turned on for emergencies. It was just how she moved through the world. How she had always moved through it, in all the ways I had been watching for 3 years. I know people expect the story to end in the parking lot, the bag going to Oslo without her, the diner booth with the untouched coffee, the moment she said I'm here with the weight of meaning it literally and in every other way at once. Those things are true, and they matter. What also matters is the 647 submission, the 8 months of documentation, the 2 students who had filed separately, the window of 26 hours, and the response that came within 40 minutes of the deadline. The turning around at the gate was one decision. The folder built across 8 months was another. They required the same thing, being unwilling to disappear quietly from something that was yours. The gate was where those 2 things met. That is why she turned around. Both of them. All of it at once. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Have you ever made it all the way to a point of no return, past the easy exits, past the moment when you thought you were already gone, and discovered that the thing you were leaving was precisely the thing you needed to come back for? And if you have, what was it? What was the thing you almost let go of, and what was the moment you realized you couldn't? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. If this is why you're here, subscribe. I'll be here.